Nice. Where do you live, in Miami?
I live in Hollywood, which is near Miami.
Yeah, I know how. I actually grew up in Miami. I grew up on South Beach, and now I live in LA.
No way. Wait.
Yeah.
I grew up in South Beach.
Did you? What part?
8th Street and Collins.
Oh, nice. So we were neighbors. I was on 2nd Street and Michigan Avenue.
Oh, man. Man, I went to Feinberg Fisher. I went to Nautilus. I went to Beach High.
Oh, no kidding. That's so cool. Yeah.
How old are you?
I was born in 1970, so that would make me in my 40s.
All right, so you're older than me. I mean, I'm born in 78. But yeah, man, I mean, I'm a beach kid. When I grew up there, they were filming Miami Vice and Scarface, you know?
Yeah, I remember that, of course.
Cool. So, you were an Orthodox rabbi or conservative?
Yes, Orthodox, Sephardic.
I converted to Judaism around almost 20 years ago. Also
nice.
in Miami Beach, but North Miami Beach. After converting, I made Aliyah. Well, I mean, after converting, I went to learning yeshiva, then I got married, then I made Aliyah. And, in Israel, I worked in outreach at Hebrew University, working for Jeff Seidel. And,
I know Jeff Seidel, sure. That's from the Kotel. He's always standing with the Kotel.
Yeah, he's a Kotel guy with the saddle shoes, Rolling Stones. And, that's what introduced me to outreach, and I've never stopped. I've just added on to it. I remember when I was in Jerusalem, I got someone to get almost like a heter for me from Rav Moshe Lazarus to say that encouraging Gentiles to become Jewish is not a bad thing. I mean, mind you, even in Hebrew U, every time we'd have an event, there's many times that we actually get more Gentiles than born Jews. And I'm not talking about Arabs. I'm talking about Christians. I mean, there's a lot of Gentiles in Hebrew University who are interested in Judaism. So then I started thinking, why don't we just start encouraging them to become Jewish? And in Israel, it's not such a big issue. Like, it's more of an issue here. Now, mind you, you can't try to convince a Muslim in Israel. He'll probably try to stab you with a screwdriver or something. But in terms of people who are interested, who are overseas students, I came to the conclusion that that's what I wanted to include in the curriculum. So I opened up a website. I started encouraging people to become Jewish, and I've been doing it ever since.
Yeah, so, I've seen some of your stuff occasionally, and it's very impressive, I would say.
Cool. All right, so where do we disagree?
Oh, I don't know that we disagree on anything. We may or may not. I don't really know.
You're Sephardi, right?
Yes.
Well, any particular branch?
Turkish and Greek, from Turkey and Greece.
So Turkish Jews consider themselves Sephardi too? Because I know sometimes people are kind of picky, you know, like Persians if you're Yemenites, call them Sephardi, they'll get upset.
Oh, no, Turkish Jews and Greek Jews that's precisely what they go by. They seem to, a lot of them seem to believe that they are the purest of Sephardic Jews because most of that community came from Spain. They came from the Spanish Inquisition originally. So, as you know, the word Sephardi means Spanish, right? So I think it's been a long-term belief in Turkey and Greece that the Jews were the prototypical, let's say, Sephardic Jews because they had come from the Spanish Inquisition.
Yeah, there's a big community in Seattle. I almost moved to Seward Park, and there's a synagogue there. It's a Greek synagogue, I think mainly from the island of Rhodes. And they have their own Siddur, their own Nusach. That's the only place in America, I think. Actually, I think Mark Angel came out of that community.
It's one of the few, it's probably one of the few communities left, as you say, that actually has a strong presence of that type of tradition. Unfortunately, most of the Turkish and Greek Jews, for some reason, either assimilated entirely or religiously assimilated into other like Ashkenazi types of Judaism, or some of the maybe Litvak or Chabad, or some of those sort of things. There was for some reason, and probably because there wasn't a strong emphasis on education when they got to America, is probably the reason why the Turkish and Greek Jews didn't really thrive as some of the other communities, like the Syrian communities and Moroccan communities did, which in a way is very sad because there was such a nice tradition. But more than that, a lot of the thinking, if you read some of the texts written by the rabbis of a couple of hundred years ago, from some of those countries, you can see some very clear and open thinking that unfortunately we don't see a lot of today in the Orthodox community, even in the Sephardic community as much.
I know in Cuba, they had a large Turkish community there. When you called someone a Turk, un turco, in the Cuban community, it was almost synonymous with Jew. There's a lot of them here in South Florida. Actually, there's a synagogue here, I believe it's called Temple Moses, that claims to have Turkish Jewish roots going way back. But cool. Do you consider yourself a mystic, more of a rationalist? Do you kid me on Pesach?
Oh, of course. I don't like to really use labels, but because we're in a world where labels are used, and this is how people understand things better. So I'll say, I definitely, the education that I've had and the experience that I've had has definitely led me away from mysticism and towards rationalism. Kidneys on Pesach, of course, we eat. That's always been the tradition for Sephardic Jews. But I personally believe that Ashkenazi Jews should be able to eat kidneys on Pesach as well, because it's not a halacha, and it's a custom of Ashkenazi countries that is no longer relevant, but they really seem to hold on to it passionately.
Mm-hmm. So you're saying that you're moving more into the rationalist camp. Does that mean embracing more the Rambam ideology or adopting a YU curriculum?
Once again, I don't really like to place labels on things, but yeah, absolutely. I'm a student of the Rambam, if you want to make it plain and simple. I consider myself, shall I say, a student of the Rambam. It started early in my education, where I started studying one of the Torah commentaries that very few people study, which is the Abarbanel. And the Abarbanel is a fascinating commentary on the Torah. It's very long, which is probably one of the reasons people don't study it. The Abarbanel asks a bunch of really interesting questions on the Parsha, and then answers them at length, And he constantly quotes the Rambam. And he himself was what I would call a semi-rationalist, or maybe a rationalist in his entirety. He wasn't such a big fan of Kabbalah. But he had his own way of thinking. He was a very self-confident person. And through studying the Abarbanel originally, I became very aware of the Rambam's, let's say, approach, just because he quotes him all the time. And the Abarbanel, though didn't always agree with the Rambam, certainly had a lot of respect for him. So that was a long time ago. That's kind of how I started studying the Rambam. And, then I started studying the Moreh Nevuchim and some of the other books of similar genre, like, for example, the Sefer Emunot V'De'ot of Rabbeinu Saadia Gaon, and Sefer Ikarim, and all of these very interesting, fascinating works that when you study in yeshiva, you're not really aware of some of these things. You know a lot about Gemara, Mishnah. If you're lucky, you're privy to the Shulchan Aruch, which nowadays even a lot of people don't even really study. But these wonderful works by great thinkers with lots of rational approach are not always brought to the attention of most people who study in yeshiva.
Right. In terms of Shulchan Aruch, people always say we don't go by the Rambam, we go by Shulchan Aruch. If people actually went by Shulchan Aruch, actual Shulchan Aruch, they'd be doing more Rambam than those who claim to go only by Shulchan Aruch. The Shulchan Aruch is around 90% Rambam, a compilation of Rosh, the Rif, and the Rambam. But
yeah, of course.
But we're kindred spirits in that. I don't consider myself a Rambamist, although I appreciate his methodology. I use him as a litmus test. If something doesn't appear in Mishneh Torah, it's most likely a later custom. There's so many customs that have crept into Judaism, and then people accept it as something actually brought down by Chazal. But if they learn a chapter a day of Mishneh Torah, they would come to realize that probably around, 45% of what we call Yahadut nowadays is completely disposable and is not grounded in Chazal.
Yeah.
And also people who come to the realization that the Zohar was not written by the Rashbi typically default back to the Rambam, because the Rambam existed at a time when there was no Zohar, right? I mean, some could say it's because it wasn't revealed yet, it was hidden amongst the Mekubalim, and some just believe it was written by Rabbi Moshe de Leon.
Yeah.
But the Rambam's codification of halakha is almost mysticism-free. It's just a plain law. Although he does bring in midrashim here and there, Merkava more, this is why people usually default to the Rambam. And, I mean, I've sort of bumped heads with Rambam is, because they do the Rambam what the mystic to do with the Gedolim nowadays, you know. I mean, the Rambam also has many opinions, and they're typically found in Mar Nevuchim. That's just a book of opinion. Opinions I embrace, but ultimately still the opinions of the Rambam. But cool, man. Yeah, so how do you view halakha? How is halakha established?
How is halakha established? Well, that's a pretty comprehensive topic, but I would say, in a nutshell, all halakha would come from the Talmud. The Talmud is our source for halakha. And one of the great things that the Rambam did by putting together the Mishneh Torah was he took the Talmud and extracted pure halakha from it. So it's like, you know, you have, this might be a bad analogy, but you know how you have, like, you know, isolated soy protein, you know, where they take the protein out of the soybean. So, you know, L'havdil, it's like the same thing. You know, the Rambam, you know, isolated the halakha out of the Talmud. And this was the original halakha, right? Later, like you mentioned, the Shulchan Aruch tried to bridge the gap between the Sephardic and Ashkenazic customs, so he took the Rosh and got the Rosh involved with the Rambam and the Rif, the Rambam and the Rif were usually, like, you know, mostly in agreement, but the Rosh was more the Ashkenazi tradition, and he tried to sort of fuse it a little bit to create a little bit of a maybe compromise, halakha compromise. But yeah, halakha has to come from the Talmud, comes, you know, and the Rambam codified it. He didn't make it up like, you know, most people seem to speak of the Rambam as if, you know, he says it or he made it up. I mean, he took it out of the Talmud. But the other thing is, like, you also have modern application of halakha, and this is something which is a very, very underdeveloped gray area, because we don't have a Sanhedrin, we don't have a Beit Din Gadol. So it's a little bit of a, I think, struggle for the halachic, let's say, leaders or the halachic authorities of today to determine how halakha has to be applied, how it has to evolve, how it has to change. This is an ongoing debate, I think, between the halachic leaders. But I personally, my personal opinion is that halakha certainly has to be adapted to the time and place. And this is, I don't
think that discussion is made anymore. I mean, the rabbis nowadays, I think, walk around establishing halakha. In other words, they feel like, and this was the opinion of the Chazon Ish, who believed that lo tasur applied to the rabbis of today. He made no distinction between actual smicha and the fake smicha invented in 1538, which is more ceremonial. I mean, it's not actual smicha. And I would say your average yeshiva bacher also makes no distinction. I mean, they think that the Rebbe has smicha going like, all the way back to Moshe Rabbeinu. So, I mean, as you know, in Parshat Shoftim, the mitzvah lo tasur, of not straying from the right to the left, it says that they will rule and judge from the place that I will choose, right? Which is the Lishkat HaGazit up on the Har Bayit, right? Not Monsey, you know, I mean, not Borough Park.
Right.
But that makes the biggest disconnect, because somebody thinks they could in some way close a case by quoting a sikha of the Lubavitcher Rebbe. You know, it's like, well, this rabbi says this. The question is, don't we have a hierarchy in Judaism? This is why I don't call it Shulchan Aruch a codification. I call it a compilation of halakha. I mean, the question is, why did we need a Shulchan Aruch when we already had a Mishneh Torah? There were previous codifications. I mean, the Rif. The thing with the Rif, he only codified Talmud Bavli, but the Rambam was the only one to codify all of halakha, the Toseftot, both Talmuds, the Sefra, the Sefri, the Mechilta, all in 14 volumes. So post the Rambam, why do we need a Shulchan Aruch? Because the world became mystified with Kabbalah, and they wanted a posek who was actually going to include the Zohar as a basis for halachic ruling, and this is where the Shulchan Aruch came out of. And then, of course, the Ramah injected Ashkenazi traditions into the Shulchan Aruch, and if the Rosh's opinions weren't enough, then you had the Chafetz Chaim and the Mishnah Berurah. I think people just use the word Shulchan Aruch to mean codification of Jewish law, right? Because you have the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch and you have the Shulchan Aruch Harav, right? And no one really knows. I mean, it's all like a big gaggle.
Yeah, but, no, you're right about that. People don't even understand. A lot of people use the word Shulchan Aruch, and they're not even, as you say, they're not using it accurately. Because oftentimes I've heard people say the Shulchan Aruch says, and they're talking about usually the Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. Sometimes they're talking about the Ramah, who theoretically is not the Shulchan Aruch. He added to the Shulchan Aruch, but the original Shulchan Aruch didn't include the Ramah.
Right, the Mapah.
Right. Yeah, the Mapah, or the Kitzur, or the Shulchan Aruch Harav, or the Shulchan Aruch written by a rabbi in Atlanta 10 years ago.
Well, Rabbi Yosef also made like a new Sephardi Kitzur Shulchan Aruch. I mean, for someone who's new to Judaism and they're searching for Shulchan Aruch, they'll walk around with a Kitzur Shulchan Aruch and say, I've mastered the whole Shulchan Aruch. I mean, actually, Your Idea hasn't even been translated into English. I think I've translated more of Your Idea than anyone. It's like if you go to Sefaria.com, and I got over 50 simonim, it'll say Asher Meza edition. I think the main reason they don't want to translate these books into English is because it leaves the power in the hands of the rabbis. And with the heavier issues, not like Orach Chaim, which is daily stuff, but I mean real, actual halakha, they don't want people who are not completely fluent in Hebrew to understand it.
Well, it's not only that. You have to remember something. It's not, people, Jews and non-Jews alike, they do what's popular, and, these things aren't popular. Nobody really wants to learn the Yoreh De'ah because there's nothing exciting about it. In yeshivot, you have maybe 4 or 5 masechtot that they're learning and a bunch of them that they're not. And this a lot has to do with, I would think, popularity, I think that's really what it is, because at the end of the day, whether you translate the Yoreh De'ah into English or not, it's, people have a tendency, human beings have a tendency to give their power to authorities. And somebody could know the Shulchan Aruch or know what the Shulchan Aruch says, but that peer pressure of, an authoritative person like a well-known rabbi, their words would overtake what the Shulchan Aruch has to say. This is what I've seen anyways. Go on.
Mm-hmm. Right. Well, that's called nowadays Das Torah. So Das Torah is the understanding that the Gedolim nowadays are the walking Sefer Torah Chai, right? They're like a human Sefer Torah, and whatever they say goes. Mind you, this movement was created in, I believe, 1919 by Agudas Israel to wield power in the Jewish community. There was always like the dumbified element in the Jewish world, which was typically, at least back then, the Hasidic movement. Now, the Hasidic movement is very respected and educated nowadays, but right when they started out, it was typically peasants who were taught to connect to God with singing and dancing, and this is one of the reasons the Vilna Gaon put them in Cherem. I mean, not just that, but I mean, they would stand on their heads and do cartwheels, and, they departed from the traditional way of learning. Now, mind you, I mean, I think they've also departed nowadays, but they're still very educated.
Yeah,
unlike
for
before.
Sure. And, I'll tell you an interesting thing about the Hasidic movement. It was, I think it was a radical response to a radical condition. In other words, the Lithuanian style of learning was very harsh. There were certainly, I mean, like you said, like you mentioned, the Vilna Gaon, and those who surrounded him were scholars. These guys learned day and night, but they did have somewhat of an elitist system that would put people down if they weren't part of their elite. And the Hasidic movement was like an extreme and radical reaction to that, which in a sense said, you don't have to be part of the elite to be loved by God. And I think because a lot of them were not learned, they started using their imagination in their service of God, rather than actually learning how to study and introducing study of Talmud and study of Halakha. which is probably where they went wrong, and it's probably why the Vilna Gaon was so unhappy with them and put them in the camp. This is the way I see it.
Well, I believe that the Hasidic movement was the reform movement of its time. Mainly, and most people don't know this, that it's actually asur to listen to music al pi halacha. It's a rabbinic commandment, and it never really stuck, but I mean, the Rambam brings it down, the Shulchan Aruch brings it down, and Rav Moshe Feinstein was someone who wouldn't let it go in our generation. But the Hasidic movement actually put that aside, and it was almost equivalent to the Reform movement bringing an organ into the synagogue, right? These guys would play instruments and dance and do all these things that because of the Churban was prohibited. And most people don't know that. I mean, they think that Jews always, sung and danced and whatever, like moved around like nanach on top of a truck. This was new. And it was really departing from the normal practice of the time. I mean, since the destruction of the temple. And I think that is one of the main reasons that the Gra put him in Cherem. It's not even, real Cherem, I don't even know. I got no issue with that. I mean, I got bigger issues with what appears in the Tanya, specifically the first parak of the Tanya, and the way it elevates or creates this notion of the Jewish soul and that Gentiles have a lesser soul from the Sitra Achra, from the Clean book. That's my bigger issue. Yechi and all that stuff, it doesn't bother me. I don't care. Not even if a Christian yells that Yashki is Mashiach. But right when you start changing Torah principles on how to be validated by God, that's when I sort of step in. Yeah.
I totally agree with you. And this is a problem not just with the Hasidic movement. This is pretty much a problem that we find throughout Orthodox Judaism in every facet of Orthodox Judaism, every shape and form of Orthodox Judaism is going to have this problem, and it's particularly rampant among those who refer to themselves by the word Baal Tshuva. They, in a sense, that movement, if you want to call it a movement, in a sense, has gotten out of control in this aspect of things. In other words, a lot of them take into their own hands the definition of how to be Jewish and how to worship God. The problem is they're not learned enough to even really begin to ponder on that.
I think it's solidified with the Mizrahi movement nowadays, the Yossi Mizrahi movement. I'm sure the guy's a nice guy, but typically the people who watch his classes over and over again, classes that are just pure agadata and mysticism and fear, sprinkled with a little bit of Torah, those are not the type of Jews we should really be trying to make. The only reason they don't want to break Shabbat is because they don't want to come back to earth as an invalid, right? Via Gilgal. Yeah. So, I mean, there's a lot of that going on online, but whatever. I mean, is it better to have it than not to have it? I don't know. I mean, I'm not smart enough to figure that one out. But yeah, I mean, I'm glad to know that we're kindred spirits on a lot of things, and I'm really surprised to know that this Rambamist movement is growing. Although I'm not a Rambamist, I think I have more in common with them than I do with Kabbalists.
Yeah.
Even though I disagree with the Rambam on a lot of things. I mean, I consider Islam idolatry. There's some parts of Christianity that I don't consider idolatrous.
What would you consider when you say Rambamist? What exactly do you mean by that?
Rambamists are people who only go by the Rambam. In other words, even in things that are just his opinion, they won't make a distinction. Right? I mean, I was having a discussion 2 days ago about the reinstitution of smicha. Right? So the Rambam writes in his Parsha Mishnayot and in Mishneh Torah that if all the Chachamim worldwide agreed on reestablishing smicha, that they could give it to one individual and that person could start the whole chain from teacher to student, just like Moshe Rabbeinu did. Right? But here he says, it seems to me, in other words, Chazal never spoke about this, never instituted it, never ruled on it. However, people were so enthralled with his teachings that in 1538 in Sfat, there was a rabbi called the Mari Beirav who restarted smicha, which is why many of the yeshivot, when they give the big siyum for smicha, is always in Sfat in the Rav Yosef Karo shul, because that was the first place smicha was revived in. So
right.
This is just one example how people make no distinction between actual halakha and the Rambam's personal teachings. In other words, they've fallen into the same trap as the rabbis of today. They've departed from the words of the Rambam. I mean, in a Hilchos Mamre, he says, Beis Din Agadol Sheber Yerushalayim Chem Ikar Torah Shebal Peh. So it's the Beis Din Agadol. I mean, it's not even him who establishes actual halakha, but just reiterates halakha. I mean, just like courts nowadays, like, shouldn't be creating laws, but like applying and interpreting the laws of the Constitution. That's where Rambamists and I differ. Right? I mean, they're strictly Rambam. I have no problem with understanding a halakha through the lenses of the Rasag or of any other of the Geonim. So that's what a Rambamist is, and that's what I'm not.
I understand. So you think a Rambamist is a purist follower of the Rambam that won't relent just because the Rambam said so. So, that's really a lot of the same, of course it's maybe like a different level, I would say, of the same thing where people just give over the power. People are saying, well, the Rambam said so and that's it. And I agree with it whether I agree with it or not. That's just sort of giving our power over. But actually, I think that a true student of the Rambam, like a real true student of the Rambam, would follow the Rambam's example, which is have an open approach, have an analytical approach to everything, including halakha, and use your intelligence to come to conclusions. Because this is really what the Rambam did, and you'll see if you look at the Mishneh Torah and then you look at some of the teshuvot of the Rambam, you'll see that the Rambam himself, he says, if I say something in one of my teshuvot, or I say something in the Mishneh Torah is the authoritative law, and that's what you have to follow. But he had advised people against halakha on numerous occasions in his teshuvot, in his personal writings to them. And you see there the intelligence, the creativity, the person seeing the bigger picture, thinking outside of the box. And I think really that's one of the fundamental characters that the Rambam carried with him. He was, of course he was a genius, he was a scholar, but he also knew how to think outside of the box. He knew how to use his intelligence. And I think a true student of the Rambam has to use their personal intelligence, even if they end up disagreeing with the Rambam. Because look, at the end of the day, the Rambam lived over 800 years ago, and the Rambam was also just, he was a brilliant scholar. He was, they say, Moshe ad Moshe, lo kam ki Moshe, of course. But he was not infallible nor is anybody, and he didn't claim to be infallible. So, back to that, I think really a true student of the Rambam is one who knows how to use their intelligence as the Rambam did, and one who knows how to think outside the box when the situation calls for, as the Rambam did.
Mm-hmm. People nowadays who are big on this no-id movement, right? I mean, they really base everything almost on the Rambam, right? Just because the Rambam writes in both in Hilchos Tshuva and Hilchos Melachim, right, that someone who keeps the Sheva Mitzvahs b'nei Noach, they're considered the Hasidu Umat Ha'olam, the Chelik and all this stuff. And this is ultimately just the Rambam's opinion. Mind you, he contradicts himself elsewhere in the Surabia, where he says if someone comes to convert, I mean, he's just quoting Chazal here, where he says when someone comes to convert, we tell them, Hamash, that Gentiles don't have a share in the world to come, but only Jews do, right? So our sages weren't monolithic on this idea, but because the Rambam made it popular, people ran with it. Also, with the notion that Islam is not idolatry. The Rambam was really like a dat yachid in this area. The vast majority of rabbis in his time believed Islam was definitely idolatry. But, I mean, the Rambam had influence. I used to be more into the Rambam than I am today, just because as I get older, I learn more, and I evolve. Cool, man. It was nice talking to you.
Okay.
But next time we should try to tackle like a specific topic. It'll probably be more interesting. But I mean, I think this is very educational for people listening, and I think this is how people learn the most, by hearing dialogues instead of monologues. Right? There's rabbis online that they talk for hours and no one challenges them.
Right.
But like iron sharpens iron.